Urmează un panel numit Rolul certificărilor în relația dintre reglementator, furnizor și operator. Domnul speaker este domnul André Wilsenach, Senior Vice President Government Relations la BMM Testlabs. Îl invit aici.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to be in Bucharest. Bucharest is one of my favorite cities in the world, and it's got great weather, beautiful location, and some great people. And it's always exciting to be present in Bucharest because of the exciting things that are happening in the gaming industry here. I had the privilege to be a regulator in jurisdictions around the world. I spent 3 years in Las Vegas training regulators, so I'm very familiar with the regulatory regime. I've moved on to BMM, and so I've seen regulation and operations around the world, but I find what's happening in Romania very interesting and very exciting. So thank you very much to the organizers for having invited me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit to you this morning about the relationship between independent testing labs, ITLs as we call them, and the role that they play relevant to government or regulation, the operator and the manufacturer. The ITLs, and I'm talking about the independent testing labs, have an interesting position where it relates to all three of those parties. And it's therefore an interesting and a careful dance that ITLs have to play. And I want to talk a little bit about that. In talking about the role of ITLs, one's got to ask yourself, first of all, what does ITLs do? Why certification? And the simple answer to that is to provide evidence. Now you may ask, why am I starting with the why question? Those of you that have done a little bit of management training will know that there's an international figure called Simon Sinek. Who of you have heard of Simon Sinek? Well, do yourself the favor, go online on YouTube and check out his video on the why question. And Simon is suggesting that the why question is probably the most important question, but is unfortunately a question that's never been asked. You know what it's like when we meet each other. We normally talk about what we do and how we do it, and I'm going to spend a lot of time on that, but we hardly ever talk about the why question. And so I just want to start off by talking about the why. So you can ask, why is it necessary to provide evidence? Well, first of all, the reason for providing evidence is purely because in a market such as gaming, there's a potential for a market failure, where the provision of services can break down between the provider and the customer. It's not in the interest of government, it's not in the interest of the manufacturer or the supplier, and that is certainly not in the interest of the operator. And therefore, to ensure that that breakdown in the marketplace between the provision of the service on the one side and the acceptance of that service doesn't break down in the market, there's a need to make sure, someone's got to make sure, that the service that's being provided is fair, secure, and auditable. And from that perspective, there is a need for ITLs to assist those three parties in, first of all, testing that the gaming equipment is fair, secure, and auditable, that it complies with certain quality assurances, that the certification that is being issued to the manufacturer is compliant with certain criteria, that training services be provided, and ITLs do a lot of that, to provide advice to regulatory authorities in respect of new developments, support for specifically new jurisdictions. Cybersecurity is a big issue at this stage, to provide some advice in that area, and lastly, to support operators in minimizing risk. Operators, you will know, those of you that operate, that it's often mostly about mitigating risk. So let's just talk a little bit about, if ITLs play that role, what are the minimum criteria or the minimum qualifications? Surely you can't have ITLs that advise, test, certify, provide quality assurances, audited inspections to make sure that that breakdown in the marketplace doesn't take place, and the ITL hasn't got certain minimum requirements with which it's got to comply. Therefore, generally, if you look around the world, these are the 4 criteria that apply for ITLs. First of all, it must be able to demonstrate that it is independent from the manufacturer and from the operator. Secondly, it must be accredited in accordance with ISO standards. And the standard that I've mentioned there, 17025, is a standard to which BMM and other testing houses around the world qualify and be subjected to, and we're inspected by the accreditation authorities on a regular basis to make sure that our staff, the testing labs, comply with those criteria. It's got to be able to demonstrate that it's got the competence in order to do that. There's certain technical competencies that you need in order to do that. And then lastly, it's very important that the key personnel who is involved are subject to certain background checks to make sure that we have that independence that I've talked about there, and that we're not involved in the gaming industry, that I don't own shares in a manufacturing company or whatever the case may be, or that I'm not a criminal. Again, this morning I got a note from our head offices in Las Vegas saying, you've got to do the following test, because as an American company, it is required of us to make sure that each and every staff member around the world is familiar with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of the United States. And therefore, I've got to go through those tests in order to subject myself that I'm familiar with what is going on. So those criteria are very, very important. As you all know, and I don't have to tell you that gaming is a matter of subsidiarity. Why am I mentioning it? The reason why I mention it is that because it's a matter of subsidiarity, operators, manufacturers have to be licensed in every jurisdiction around the world. The competency is normally devolved to the lowest levels of government, and therefore you need to hold a license in each of those jurisdictions, which puts testing houses, independent testing houses, in the situation where we have to literally do business around the world. That's why we're providing services in 460 jurisdictions, and we're operating 15 labs around the world. So let's talk about the why. We've talked a little bit about the why. We've talked about what it is that we do. Let's look a little bit about how do we support regulators, firstly. Now, in order to understand how you support regulators as an ITL, it's important to understand the role of the regulator. And as I said before, if you would look at any regulator today, if you would go to the annual reports of regulators and you would look at it, you will see that they have the following goals. First of all, and the panel before us talked about money laundering. The first objective is always to keep out crime of the industry. Second is to make sure that young people and the vulnerable are protected. And the third, which is very important, is to make sure that the games that are being offered is fair, secure, and auditable. Those are very important criteria, very important objectives. So ITLs would support regulators specifically in that area. And how it does it is to provide evidence that all gaming products meet certain minimum requirements, provide various points of verification, which then facilitate trust. I remember as a regulator, you're often in the situation where you've got to deal with a player dispute. A player has a complaint, a dispute arises, and you take great comfort from the fact that you have testing houses and labs who have done certain checks and have certified that equipment to be fair, to be secure, and auditable. Provide independent analysis and guidelines to regulators. We often find that in jurisdictions where we provide these services, the regulators would call us in, all the independent testing labs, we will sit around the table and we would provide advice to those regulators in respect of the latest developments that are taking place and the issues that we as independent testing houses have observed that may need addressing in the regulations and in the technical standards. Provide feedback on where the industry is heading. Often as an independent testing lab doing business around the world, you see different trends. We all talk about new technologies coming in, the role of AI, the role of blockchain, cryptocurrencies, skill-based gaming. And so one can continue as a result of changes that are taking place. And being in a position where we can observe these trends and tendencies around the world, it puts us in a position where one can give feedback and advice to regulators. And then finally, to discuss new policy objectives with regulators. So let's talk about how ITLs relate to suppliers. Suppliers is a very important group to which we relate. And if you look at the role of a supplier, it is simply to provide products and services that meet public demands subject to regulatory requirements. If you look at the fact that suppliers today need to have a very thorough understanding of what it is that the customer wants, and therefore they develop products that would meet those requirements. Obviously they can't just meet the requirement, they've got to look carefully at what are the regulatory requirements. And that's where independent testing labs often play an important role. It provides independent analysis, provide confirmation of how the product is supposed to work, considering quality assurances, product assurances, and also regulatory requirements. Provide evidence that the product is compliant with the public policies and the regulations. And it often provides or improves minimum technical standards. Those of you that are familiar with supplying equipment around the world will know that most jurisdictions have certain minimum requirements. And as independent testing labs, observing developments around the world, we're in a position to make input on the development of those technical standards. Lastly, let's just talk a little bit about how we relate to operators. To do that, we've got to understand operators' responsibilities. First of all, the role is to provide services to customers in an environment which is safe, fair, and enjoyable. And secondly, a point which is often forgotten about is the importance that operators pay taxes to government. I was in a discussion not so long ago in a jurisdiction where we were talking about testing and certifying a betting operation. And the particular regulator was thinking about what criteria or minimum standards they would need for that betting operation. It was a new jurisdiction. And so the discussion went down the route where there was an advisor who said to the regulator, when it comes to betting, it's very simple. You don't need sophisticated systems. Therefore, our advice is that when it comes to betting, you don't need any testing or certification. And so I said, well, how do you then make sure that the correct taxes are paid? How do you make sure that that system that supports those transactions in actual fact secure and is able to support that principle? And that is often forgotten when it comes to the responsibility of operators. And again, when we deal with operators around the world, there's a number of services that we typically provide. Again, operators, as I said initially, is dealing with what are the risks associated with the business and therefore how to mitigate those risks. Make sure that the games comply with the minimum standards. Help operators to identify trends and issues during the operation. A question that we often get is that our mix on the floor is giving us all sorts of trouble. Can you advise us on how we can improve the mix? Help operators identify products that have fallen out of compliance, ensuring that systems can accurately calculate gaming tax. Those are typically the things that ITLs would do. This is my last slide. And I thought what I would do is end this presentation by just running through the issues that arise from a typical player complaint. If you deal with player complaints, you can see the interaction between ITLs, operators, and manufacturers and regulators quite clearly. Where if you do get a complaint that's lodged, that complaint is normally lodged in the first instance with the operator. The operator's got to deal in the first instance with that complaint in terms of legislation. There's a requirement to deal with that in the first instance and trying to resolve that complaint. Therefore, the operator, oh dear, I think I've lost it. Therefore, the operator in the first instance would the operator would in the first instance do an investigation into the complaint, and normally if the complaint relates to a payment malfunction, it is referred to the regulator. Why is it important that the regulator becomes involved in the case of a payment malfunction? Purely because the regulator has a keen interest to understand how malfunctions may impact taxes. And therefore, the regulators normally around the world may want to have an understanding of what is happening there. If the complaint relates to a technical malfunction, the operator has a number of options. It can go to the manufacturer, or it can go to the testing lab. And very often when it refers to the manufacturer may refer to the testing lab. Sometimes it gets referred to the supplier, who in turn goes to the testing lab, as I just said. And then when it is about responsible gaming, as is often the case, then clearly it is something that the operator would want to deal with directly. Ladies and gentlemen, that is in short terms the role of the ITL. I'm not necessarily saying it is specific to Romania or to any particular jurisdiction, but what I've just described to you is the way in which ITLs relate to operators, regulators, and manufacturers around the world.